Hey there, and thanks for joining me for this screencast. My name is David Anderson with Decom Engineering. I'm going to show you how to restyle many of the WPF built-in controls, things like buttons, things like text boxes, list views, combo boxes, and things like that. I've had a lot of feedback from you guys in the comments from my MVVM videos asking me how to do these things. So we're going to venture into a series of videos where I'm going to do one control per video. And we're going to start out with actually the button control, and we're going to show you how to make a reusable theme library. So by the time we go through all these different controls, you should have a very basic starting point for building your own application theme. So to get started, we actually have an empty Visual Studio solution here. I'm using Visual Studio 2013. You can use 2012 or 2010, entirely up to you. I'm going to add two new projects. The first project will be just a desktop app that we're going to use to demonstrate the usage of these controls that we retemplate as we go through these videos. And we're just going to call this WPF theme demo.desktop client. And for actually building the theme, we're going to add a WPF user control library. Now you can use regular class library. You can also use a WPF custom control library. Either or, you can still add Zamel files to each of those and resource dictionaries. You can add references to presentation framework and Windows base and all that good stuff. But when WPF user control library and custom control library, Visual Studio handles those a little bit better, and it allows you to add things a little bit easier just because the project template. So we're going to call this WPF theme, capitalize T, WPF theme demo.windows, just to be consistent with the way .NET named the WPF layer in .NET. And we're going to call this .theme. And we can just nuke this user control.xaml file completely. We don't need that. Now for themes to work in WPF, at least for what we're going to do, we need to add a new resource dictionary right away. And we're going to call this theme.xaml. And this will essentially be where we gather the collection of control styles, so that way we can just reference just the theme.xaml from our application. So before we actually get into building this stuff, let's do that now. Let's go to our app.xaml in our desktop client and reference that. And to do that, it's very simple. We're going to use a merged resource dictionary. So in our application.resources, we're going to create a new resource dictionary. And we're going to do resource dictionary.merge dictionaries. And then we're going to do resource dictionary again. And we're going to essentially say source equals and the name of our assembly, so WPF theme demo.windows.theme semicolon component / and then the path to the file, which would be theme.xaml. And we need to add a reference to that library file so it knows where to pull it from. And there we go. So very straightforward. So again, reference to our theme library from the desktop client, a merge dictionary with a reference to the location of that XAML file. Okay, so let's go ahead and close out everything except for our theme.xaml, and we're going to kind of do the same thing. We're going to do resource dictionary.merge dictionaries, and we're going to also say resource dictionary source, and then for this we're going to say button style.xaml, and this is actually in our theme.xaml file, and we're going to create a button style XAML resource dictionary, and that's where we're going to be doing all of our work. So we're going to do that in the theme library. So we're going to say add new resource dictionary. I'll call this button style, and now our theme.xaml can see that. So creating styles and retemplating controls in WPF is actually a lot easier than you think. The most important piece is you need to know ahead of time kind of how you, at least a concept idea of what you want your control to look like. In this case, we need to decide What colors do we want the button to be? Do we want to animate when the user moves their mouse over it? Do we want to animate when they click on the button? You know, the pressed state versus a non-pressed state. Do we want a border and things like that? So yes, we want all those things. So I'm going to show you kind of different ways we can approach this. Now, personally, what I like to do is mock up my colors and kind of how I want my controls to look in Adobe Photoshop. Now, you don't have to do this. I'm just doing this mainly for the color picker that Photoshop has. You can use anything else like paint.net, the GIMP. You can use the color picker out on the web. You don't even have to use a color picker. You can just do this in Visual Studio. But I'm going to create a blank canvas, and I'm going to create a new layer. I'm just going to go ahead and drag a rectangle out here and fill that with a foreground color. We'll go ahead and stick with blue, and I'll add a gradient overlay pattern to this guy, and then we'll basically say color burn, and we'll pick a, or actually, excuse me, normal for the blending mode. And we're just going to pick some shades of blue. Now I'm going to darken these shades of blue, and this is going to be kind of the colors that I want for our default state of the button. Okay, so I'm going to click OK. And then I'm going to add probably a 2 pixel stroke and make that light gray, like so. Okay, so this just gives me an idea of what I want my button to like. And the reason I'm doing this, and again, like I said, you don't have to use Photoshop, but you can use anything you want, is I'm going to grab this eyedropper tool, and I'm going to grab the ARGB values for the colors. So I'm going to take my first color, and I'm going to take the light color value. I'm going to switch my palette, and I'm going to take the dark color value. And we're going to do the light color value first. And basically, I'm going to take note of the RGB value, which is 0, 133, 209. Now I'm going to go to my resource dictionary. We're going to add a color, or we're going to call this, we're going to add a key values because this is a resource. We're going to call this background color 1. And the alpha value, we'll make 255, full alpha. And then we'll say red, green, blue. And then we'll add those color values, which again, 0, 133, 209. Okay, and we're gonna do the same thing, except this will be background color 2. And we'll take the dark color value, which is 06194. Now I'm going to take these because when we hover over our button, we want to make the color a little bit lighter, and we want to animate it. So we're going to take those two values, and we're going to do the same exact thing, except we're going to call these mouse over. And we're going to go ahead and close this. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a color overlay. I'm going to pick a kind of a light colored blue, and I'm going to just kind of change the blending mode, so I don't have to do too much work until I find something I kind of like. And that looks pretty good. We just want it to be kind of subtle but not too drastic. So I'm going to go ahead and enable that. Now I'm going to grab the color values for these two colors. So we'll do the same thing. We'll grab the light value, which is 0, 156, 231. And then we'll take the dark value, which is 0, 90, 155. Okay, so now we kind of have our baseline for some colors to work with, but now we actually need to start templating the control. So the way this is done is we can actually define a style whose target type is a button. And we're going to say setter property, and we want to basically say we're going to override the button's control template. So you can see that the property name is template and it's of type control template. Now, when you do this, what I want you to remember is that essentially when you're at this point, you have full reign to decide what your button looks like. You basically think of it as a blank canvas. You can define a border, you could use a text block, you could use grids and dock panels and whatever you want. It's a blank slate that you can work with. So we need to do setter.value, and we're going to say we want to set this to the value of the control template whose target type is also a button. And we know that we want a border for our button, and let's say that the border brush is, and we'll go ahead and create a new static resource for this, but we'll call this border brush, and we'll say the border thickness is 4. And let's go ahead and create that new resource. We'll say solid color brush. And we'll do a light gray, which is EC, EC, EC. And for our border thickness, instead of putting the value of 4 here, what we can do is we can basically do a template binding, because button itself exposes, I believe, a border thickness. And we can basically say the value is 4. And then what we can do here is basically say template binding border thickness. So these are properties that the button control itself exposes. They're dependency properties. And basically what we're doing is we're basically retemplating it to use our own layout, but we're saying go ahead and reuse the existing dependency property of border thickness that the button already exposes. And what this allows is you can override this property and override this style or tweak it without having to retemplate the entire control. And that's kind of the key behind making these custom controls flexible. And we could actually do the same thing for border brush. Because the button control exposes that, we could say setter property border brush, and then we'll do setter, and actually let's go down here, value, and we can do the same exact thing. Move the static resource up here to the template, and then we'll do template binding border brush. So this will allow people to override specific areas of the controls. So if someone wanted to tweak this button and just modify the border brush, they could do that without having to retemplate the entire thing. So now what we want to do is that we have our border. We want to define a background. We're going to do the same thing. We're going to do setter property background. Now for this, we're going to do setter value. Actually, excuse me, this needs to be in the control template, and I'll show you why here in just a second. So we're going to do border.background, and we're going to do a linear gradient brush. We're going to say the start point is 0, 0, so upper left-hand corner, and the end point 0, 1. We'll make this a linear top to bottom gradient. And then what we're going to do is we're going to say gradient stops. We're going to find the color points of the gradient. So this will start at the very top, and then the color will be, again, a static resource to our background color 1. And then we'll do the same thing, except this will be at the bottom, and this will be a background color 2. And we need to name these, and we'll essentially call these background gradient stop 1 and background gradient stop 2. Now the reason we need these in the control template is because we need to be able to animate when the user mouses over the button. We want to change those two values, the color values of each gradient stop. And the way we do that is we're going to say control template dot triggers, and we're going to create a new multi-trigger. And the reason we're doing a multi-trigger is because we want to only animate if the button is enabled and the mouse is over. So we need both of those conditions, which is what we're going to do. So we're going to say multi-trigger dot conditions, and the first condition will essentially be is enabled, and the value must be true. And the second condition will be is mouse over, value equals true. And then what we want to say is that when the user mouses into the button, we want to essentially kick off a new animation storyboard. So we're going to do multi-trigger.interactions, and we're going to say begin a new storyboard. So basically we're saying begin a animation, and the storyboard that we're going to do essentially will be a bunch of color animations, and we're going to need two of them, one for the first gradient stop and one for the second gradient stop. And we're going to name this storyboard. So we're going to say mouse over animation, and we're going to do two color animations. So these are pretty simple actually. The gist of a color animation is that we need to say what the target is, in this case the first gradient stop, and what's the property that we're animating, in this case color. And then we're going to say what color do we want to animate this to, and that will essentially be the static resource we created earlier, which will be mouse over background color 1. And then we also need to specify a duration, and we're going to say 0 hours, 0 minutes, 0 seconds, and I believe this is 100 milliseconds. And we can just take this whole color animation and duplicate that for the second background gradient stop, except we're going to change the color to color number 2. Okay, now at this point we kind of have a basic template. We have a border, we have a trigger to do our animation when the user mouses over it. One thing that we also need to do is define our content presenter. We want people to add text to the button, maybe images, and we're going to basically say our content presenter has a margin that is equal to template binding padding, because remember this is inside our border control. And we can do the same thing. We could take this border and we could define its margin as template binding and use the button's margin property. And we'll kind of cascade these down, make it easier to read. Okay, now we can test this real quick. We can go to our main window, and we had already, I want the app.zamel, modified our app.zamel to include this theme file. So we're just going to build a project, make sure everything compiles real quick, and then what we're going to do is real quick, because I forgot one last thing, is in our border we want to change this border thickness to 2, just make that a little bit more crisp. Now we're going to go to our main window and we're going to declare a button. We're just going to give it some text, so we'll do I'm a button, something simple, and then we'll say our width is 72 pixels, our height is, let's do 32. Okay, let's actually do 96. Now if we run this, we can see that we already have the style of our button in our application. Now if I hover over this, we can see that it slowly animates with the different kind of the lighter colors that we added to the template. Now if I mouse out, nothing animates it back to its original colors, so we have to do those visual states as well, which we're going to do now. So we'll go back to our button style.zamel, and this is pretty easy. We're just going to go back down to our multi-trigger that we had for animating the colors in, and we're going to essentially do multi-trigger.exit actions instead of interactions. So we'll just do the exact opposite. So we'll do exit actions, and we can do almost the same exact thing. We're going to take this whole storyboard, except we'll call this mouse out animation, and then we can actually just say let's animate our colors back to the originals. So we're going to say our static resources are just our original colors, background color 1 and background color 2, and that will be our exit action. Now if we run our app again, now we animate it in, and we can see the color change. It's very subtle. Now if we animate out, we can see it restored back to the original colors. So there we go, it changed, and there we see it changing back. Now let's close this, and our border isn't very visible, so let's go ahead and change our border brush to a little bit of a darker color. Now if you have a Sharper, which is a productivity tool for developers made by JetBrains, you can go over here and say pick from color palette, and it'll show up with their color picker dialog essentially, and you can just kind of change it a little bit. You can run the app and see the difference that that makes, and we can see our borders a little bit more visible at this point. And maybe we want to change that to just a 1 pixel border, for example. And there we go. So now what we want to do is animate essentially the mouse down and mouse up animations, which are very similar to mouse over and mouse out, except these will be kind of their own triggers. So this one will be another multi-trigger, and the property that we care about for pressing down is the isPressed property. So we're going to do multi-trigger, and then we're going to say conditions, and our first condition again will be is enabled. Our second condition will again be is pressed. So those are our conditions. And we're going to do the same thing. We're going to say multi-trigger dot interactions, and then we'll say again begin as storyboard. And you can use some of these previous animations kind of as a template as you go along because they're very similar. So we're going to copy this entire storyboard, except we're going to call this mouse down animation. And really what we need to do now is kind of define some dark colors that we want the button to represent when we press on it. So we're going to go to this layer that I had in Photoshop. We're going to get rid of this color overlay and just kind of see the difference between what it looks like originally, what it looks like when we add a color overlay. But now we want to make it dark, so we're going to take this blue, and we're going to make it kind of a really dark blue. So now you can see that the button looks quite a bit darker than even its original state, and that's exactly what we want. So we're going to say enable that. And again, we're going to take those two colors. So we're going to take the light color first, which is 098195 for the RGB values. And again, you can use these color resources as templates. And we're going to say mouse pressed background 1 and mouse pressed background 2. And what I say those color values were 098195, 098195. Okay, and then we'll take the dark value 03672. So now we have those colors. So we can go down here to our animation and do the same thing. So we're going to say mouse pressed background color 1 and mouse pressed background color 2. So if we're to run that, again, we still have our mouse over animation, mouse out. Now when we go over this, when we press down, you can see that we have our mouse down animation, so the button got quite a bit darker. But if I release my mouse, we don't have any animation back to the original state, which is mouse over animation. So we need to add the exit actions for the multi-trigger, which we're going to take this entire interactions section, copy that in there. We're going to call this mouse up animation. And what we want to do is, and this needs to be exit actions. What we want to do is basically restore it back to the colors when the mouse is hovering over the button. So we're going to go up here and we have our mouse over background color 1 and 2. And those are the colors that we want to restore the button to. So now we can run this. And we have mouse over, mouse down, and if we lift back up, now we have our restored state. Now, I want you to notice something. When I took the mouse out, it didn't animate back to the original colors. It stayed the colors of the mouse over animation. Now, the trick to this is there's a feature on these storyboards called fill behavior. And let's go ahead and add that, and I'll show you what that does. And we actually need to add that to both the mouse up animation. So we're going to say storyboard fill behavior, and the fill behavior we want to use is stop. Now, if you read the intelligence for this, basically what this does is the timeline stops if it is outside its active period while its parent is inside its active period. So what we're saying is after this animation is over, stop the animation. And we need to do the same thing for mouse out. And if we run this, there's our mouse over animation, mouse out, mouse over, mouse down, mouse up, and mouse out. And now it restores back to its original state like we expect. So basically what we have here is pretty much a fully animated button. We have all of our different states. I can click and the colors will restore back and forth. But we also, if we go to our window and we set this guy to is enabled equals false, when we run this, we shouldn't get any animations because one of our trigger values was that we don't want to animate if it's not enabled. But we do need to change the color of the button when it's disabled. So we're going to do that next. So we're going to go to our button style.zamel and we're going to add some additional colors. We're going to say is not enabled background color 1. And you don't have to use gradients for this, although we are. And we're going to do the same thing. So we're going to say our alpha is 255. Red is 0, and we'll pick some colors in Photoshop here in a second. We'll do the same thing. 2. And let's take this and let's add a color overlay, but let's change this to a desaturated color and then change the blending mode. And actually maybe we want to pick some lighter gray colors, but that's fine. So let's actually do this. Let's pick, that looks like a good gray. Two through three. Okay, and then we want to do kind of the same thing. We want to add a trigger for when the button is not enabled, and we'll add this one at the top. So we'll say, this is just a normal trigger, doesn't have to be a multi-trigger. I'll say is enabled, and the value is false. Now, you can animate this in like we did the other actions, whether you're mousing over or mousing out or pressing down or pressing up. But what I like in a button is when it gets enabled or disabled, I like it to happen immediately. So we're just going to use a normal trigger for this. And we're going to do the same thing. We're going to create some setters. And we're we're going to say, actually, target name is again our background gradient stop 1, and the property will be color, and the value will be static resource is not enabled background color 1. Let's go ahead and cascade these so they're easier to read, and then we'll do the same exact thing for the second gradient stop. So now if we run this, now what we need to remember here is that with a trigger, the target name on a setter does not work with dependency properties. It only works with framework elements or framework content elements. So what I mean by that is if we do setter and we try to do target name background gradient stop 1, that won't compile. So we do have to use a storyboard for this. So we're going to do the same things. We're going to say trigger dot enter actions, and we're going to say begin storyboard. And we'll create a storyboard, and we'll give this a name, and we'll call it disabled animation. And we're going to do the same thing. We're going to do a color animation. We'll do a static resource to our is not enabled background color 1. And then we could basically, I think, not define a duration, and it would be instant. Let's go ahead and give that a look and see. So that didn't look instant, actually. So let's actually just say duration is 0. And that time it was instant. So we're going to go back and we're going to do the same thing, except for our second gradient stop. So now we have ourselves a disabled button that when we mouse over it and we click and we try to perform all those actions, it does not animate at all. And you may have to do a similar thing where, and let's just test this theory real quick. Let's give this button a name. And then let's create a second button. And we'll create a little click event. And we'll just say a button 1 is enabled equals true. And this will just kind of allow us to, and we need to go to our window here. Let's just make this a stack panel for simplicity. So one button is enabled, one's not. So we're going to click this and it should re-enable our other button. So what we see though is it didn't, when we re-enabled it, animate back out of the disabled state. So we do need to add the exit actions for that. So we can do that. Now for the exit actions, we can kind of do a similar thing. Oops, give it a caps lock. And we'll call this we'll call this enabled animation. And what we'll do is we'll just restore this to its normal state. So we'll say background color 1 and background color 2 and rerun this. So now what we'll have is when we click this, Now we can see that it went back to its normal state when we re-enabled the button, and that's exactly what we wanted. So what you can see is now that we have a fully animated button. We could center our text if we wanted to, so we could provide basically a default template. And to do that, basically we're going to say what I did earlier, and we're going to use template bindings. So we're going to go to our content presenter and basically say horizontal alignment is equal to the template binding of the horizontal content alignment for the button control, and then do the same thing for vertical alignment. And what we'll actually do is say that the content of this content template is equal to a template binding of content. Oops. Content, like so. And then we'll basically also say content template is equal to template binding of content template. So this makes our button extensible, so others can, like I said, tweak parts of the button without having to retemplate the entire thing. They can provide a content template for their own. So again, we have our margin, which is equal to template binding, padding, content, and for good practice, it's usually good to name the different parts of your controls. So we'll give this a name, and we'll just call this content presenter, like so. Now if we run the app, now we could see that we have centered text. So we have essentially a fully functional button control. The animations that we did in this video are a little subtle. The colors are very similar, but you could tweak it to your heart's content. We could even go back and do things like, say, border. And we could check to see if the button exposes a corner radius, and it does it. So we will go to our border and say corner radius is equal to, oh, I don't know, 6. And now we have rounded buttons. So you can do a lot. So retemplating and styling WPF controls, not that bad. The one thing I will say is, how do you know where to start? The button control is one of the more simple controls to do. Now something like a combo box is actually made up of multiple parts. So you have a button for the piece on the right hand side that displays the pop-up menu. You have the area that could be a text box if the combo box is editable, or it could just be a border, no text box at all. So those types of controls get a little bit more complicated because there's more pieces and they're more interactive than a button is. A button is strictly just a click control with some animations and some styling, so it's a good place to start. Now what I can say is MSDN, let me drag this tab over here from Internet Explorer. If you go to MSDN, they have a page, and this is the Silverlight section, but you can find the WPF section as well. They have articles on customizing controls, and what you can find in here is they also have templates and things like that for each of the other controls. Now some of these, I believe these ones specifically, are more visual state managers, and that would be one way to animate the controls, but you don't have to. And these aren't actually the control templates that I'm thinking of. They're kind of hard to find. But if I find the link, I will post it in the video description when I upload this video. And you can also go to Expression Blend if you have that installed. So Blend for Visual Studio 2012 or 2013. And I'll show you a cool trick. So new project, WPF. I'll do a WPF app. And we'll just drag, oh, I don't know, let's drag a, well, let's go and do a comma box. Okay, so there's a combo box. If you right click on that guy you can go down to edit template and we'll say edit a copy, and we'll say combo box style 1, and we'll say let's go ahead, we'll go ahead and define it in a new resource dictionary. And if you look at the Zamel for this guy, here is the default control template for a combo box. And you can see that the combo box is quite a bit more than a button control, but again, still workable. And you can use these kind of as a baseline to customize the control as you see fit, so you don't necessarily have to write it from scratch like we did for the button control. But I did want to go through the motions and the steps so you can kind of see the process. So we'll go ahead and cut it off there. And like I said, if you think these videos are useful, make sure to like and subscribe in the buttons below, because I will be doing more of these, and we will actually do things like the combo box, the text box, list view, and things like that. So thank you very much for all your support and watching these videos, and hopefully this helps you dive into customizing your WPF applications.